Hello, this is a new edition of Conversaciones Americanas. Today we will do it in English because we have a particular guest and a special guest that is Professor Phil Brenner. Professor Phil Brenner is an emeritus professor at American University, and he has been in the last 30, I will say 40, 50 years, one of the most important scholars in the United States studying U.S.-Cuba relations. He studied also other topics such as congressional politics in the United States and also U.S. relations with Latin America. It is a great pleasure for us that Professor Brenner is with us. Phil, it's an honor. I want to ask you first, what was your main motivation to study Cuba and Latin America?
So first, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And your audience should know that you as well are a very highly respected scholar about Cuba. So when I was in graduate school in the 1960s, I was studying Latin America, comparative politics more formally, with an emphasis on Latin America. And at that time, if you were studying Latin America, Cuba was a necessary topic because U.S. foreign policy, which was one of my interests, was shaped by three words: no more Cubas. That was what Lyndon Johnson said, no more Cubas. That was all of U.S. policy towards Latin America. And so, of course, it became a fascination, but there was very little information. Very few scholars from North America were allowed into Cuba. And I, at the time, was also studying Congress. In 1969, I helped to found a journal called Politics and Society. 1974, one of the editors, Alan Wolfe, who's now a very famous sociologist, was invited to go to Cuba. And I said, this is outrageous. I'm the person on our editorial board who knows something about Latin America. I should be able to go. And so when he came back, he arranged for me to get an invitation to go to Cuba. What I didn't know at the time was that their interest in me was not that I knew something about Latin America, it was that I knew something about Congress. Because it was at this moment that Cuba was beginning to invite members of Congress to go to Cuba. And so
when you say this moment, we are talking
1974,
about 1974.
So that's when I made my first trip to Cuba. And I then brought down a group of other scholars to talk to them. And their knowledge about Congress was extraordinarily limited. They studied a book by a former Soviet ambassador, S.I. Menshikov, called Millionaires and Managers.
Oh,
and
yeah.
The theme of this book,
I have read it.
The theme of this book is that Congress is controlled by different groups: the Mellon Group, the Rockefeller Group, the Harriman Group, different large American interests, which is not accurate. And so I was just stunned. I gave a lecture at the University of Havana, and they asked me about what groups there are in Congress. I said nothing, and anyway, when I came back 3 years later to give another lecture at the University of Havana, and in those 3 years they had studied so much. Now the questions were about roll call analysis. They wanted to understand path, and they were very sophisticated questions that you would get at any advanced seminar in the United States. So they had learned a lot, and it was because in September of 1974, Senator Claiborne Pell and Jacob Javits went to Cuba, and then there was a series of trips by members of Congress as part of a beginning détente in the mid-1970s.
Well, now that you mentioned this, I didn't plan that this will be the first question, but when we read about the promotion of better relations with Cuba in the history, we mention a lot on the executive branch, but if you look at this period that you are mentioning, it's clear that the Committee of the 40 in which Gerald Ford was one of the members, and others initiative from Congress put the issue of Cuba as necessary for a rapprochement or a necessary rapprochement with Cuba as part of the détente policy that was promoted by Kissinger originally, despite the point that Nixon made that Cuba should not be part of this approach necessarily. What can you remember about that? How important is Congress in the policy towards Cuba?
Well, I'll tell you precisely because I've done research about this. So Kissinger, behind Nixon's back, in mid-1974, began to allow this détente to occur. The staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Pat Holt, wanted to go to Cuba. He worked for Senator Fulbright from Arkansas, and he had been denied the right to go to Cuba because you needed a license to go to Cuba because we have an embargo against Cuba. And in order to spend any money, you needed a license. He was denied a license to go to Cuba. And then in June of 1974, this is a point when Nixon is falling apart because of Watergate. His focus is wholly on surviving the fallout of Watergate. Kissinger gave Pat Holt the right. Kissinger was now Secretary of State, gave Pat Holt the right to travel to Cuba as a preparatory trip for the visit by Pell and Javits. I interviewed Kissinger about this some years later, and he said that in fact he was concerned that Congress was starting to beat up the administration because they were doing nothing, and so it was less about détente with the Soviet Union and more about satisfying the Congress. And he thought there could be some benefits out of it as well in terms of U.S. relations with Latin America. Of course, as you mentioned, détente. It was Kissinger's concern about détente that led to the breakdown of relations with Cuba, because Cuba then, in 1975, sent troops to Angola. Kissinger felt this was a slap in his face, and the negotiations with Cuba and the United States were cut off.
Well, here there is also a case of clear misperception, because Kissinger attribute Cuba's presence in Angola to a Soviet design, and in reality, what we were seeing was an autonomous action by Cuba that was more connected with its third world anti-colonial dimension more than its position as part of the alliance with the Soviet Union.
That's precisely right. But Kissinger saw the world very much first in terms of balance of power, but also in very personalistic terms. So he had authorized a relaxation in the embargo against Cuba. And in 1975, he changed the embargo so that Cuba could purchase goods from US corporations in third countries. For example, from Ford in Argentina.
Yes.
And that was very important for Cuba because it was a big break in the embargo. In fact, over the next 17 years, Cuba purchased largely food and medicine. 95% of what they purchased was food and medicine. But it was an opening for US corporations too, especially, and some of our allies. And then the United States voted in the Organization of American States to end the hemispheric-wide embargo against Cuba. He felt these were great gifts to Cuba, particularly to Fidel Castro. And then he felt it was a personal slap in the face. That's what he described it when Cuba sent, or Castro sent, troops into Angola, which was not the case. I mean, that it was, as you say, autonomous from other considerations.
So now I have a very important question that comes from the the original design that I have, but it connects here. Phil, now we are seeing that this situation that was so important in the time of the Cold War, in which the priority of Cuba in the US foreign policy agenda was very high, because in part of Cuba's alliance with the Soviet Union, this level of priority is something that is difficult to imagine in the current world. So how will you frame US-Cuba relation in terms of what are the priorities of these relations? What are the issues that you will consider put Cuba on as a first rank, second rank, third rank, fourth rank in the agenda of American foreign policy? How do you see that this change of priorities? Well, this is a premise that I am assuming. Perhaps you want to question it, but how do you think that this change in the priorities affect the relationship between Cuba and the United States? And connected with this, it is clear that when a small country find, I don't want to use the word pattern because this is so much based on an American approach of political science. And I like to see it also from my condition of an American citizen, but also a Cuban who grew up in Cuba. And I don't like the idea that any approach to a great power is in search of a patron. But obviously, any outbalancing of the role of a great power in the neighborhood represent, when it means an alliance with a rival, represent some balancing in the asymmetry. But in this case, Cuba, today, it is very difficult that it could find in China or even in the Russian Federation such balancer for the asymmetry with the United States. How do you think that this lack of an option as such, at least in the short term, nobody knows where the world will be if the course of confrontation with China keep going, but how would you frame a U.S.-Cuba relationship in the context of the post-Cold War world?
Arturo, this is a very profound question, and I'm glad you asked it. It's going to take a little time to answer this question.
Well, I'm asking to a person that I feel is well capable of providing at least a lot of insight about that. That's why I wanted to interview you.
So I'm sorry that I have to go back so much in history, but let me remind your audience that in 1960, Cuba was not a communist country. In fact, Fidel Castro had bad taste in his mouth about communists because the Communist Party of Cuba, which was called the Populist Socialist Party, did not support the July 26th movement or the revolution against Batista. There were few members who did, Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, but the party itself did not support it. And so Cuba was not a communist country in 1960. It was not allied with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union recognized Cuba, and Cuba recognized the Soviet Union only in May of 1960, a year and a half after the revolution succeeded. So it wasn't so much the fear of the Soviet Union. What the United States was concerned about was Cuba being independent, being neutral. And in fact, we have documents showing that the concern was that Cuba would be an example for other countries in the Western Hemisphere that want to have a neutralist stand. The perspective from the United States was there were only two possibilities. You were either with us or against us, with the United States or with the Soviet Union. There was no room for neutrals. A neutral was against us. And so that perspective shaped US foreign policy in 1960 when Cuba was doing this. And it affected US policy with Brazil. I mean, we essentially told Yaneo Quadros, the president elected in 1960, to get out of office because he wanted a neutral policy towards the United States and the Soviet Union. And in fact, he left shortly after we sent an ambassador down there to read him the Riot Act. Then, once Cuba became closer to the Soviet Union, which didn't really happen until 1962, the United States then became concerned about the Soviet Union. And then, of course, in 1962, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, so-called. And that scared people, that the Soviets would put missiles in there. And in fact, that became a focus, the Soviet-Cuban alliance. Now, to take your point precisely, Cuba in all of this was seen as a pawn. It was not seen as an independent agent. It was seen as a puppet of the Soviet Union. And so, in fact, that's the way the United States thought about many countries that had become communist, that they were simply like the Vietnamese, that they were simply puppets of the Soviet Union. And that was a wrong-headed way of understanding US foreign policy and led us into many, many complications like the Vietnam War. There's a young scholar, Tom Long, at the University of Warwick, who's now writing about the way in which Latin America, small powers, have their own agency, and in fact are not necessarily dominated by large powers. They work around them to secure their own interests. Cuba ultimately became obliged to the Soviet Union because of the aid, but it never took direction from the Soviet Union. And in fact, in the 1960s, there was almost a break in relations. Fidel Castro thought that the Soviet Union was fomenting a coup against him and to put in place one of the old communists. And so there was a lot of tension between the countries that ultimately ended in the early 1970s when Cuba became a member of the Soviet bloc. At that point, US foreign policy continued to act as if Cuba was a member of the Soviet bloc, was a puppet. It wasn't its own actor. And so when Cuba goes into Angola, naturally Kissinger thinks this is the Soviets sending them there. Although, as you correctly say, that wasn't the case. In fact, Cuba, Fidel Castro hid the fact from the Soviet Union that they were sending troops there. I think I just lost my video.
I don't know what happened there. Oh, now it's
I hit a key. I talk with my hands. It's a problem. And so one of the things that Cuba, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Cuba felt abandoned by the Soviet Union, was that Cuba embarked on a foreign policy that would enhance the third world, getting allies in the third world. And it's at that point that they actively began to try to export revolution, to essentially help independence movements against colonial powers. And that was principally in Africa, against the Portuguese that still had colonies, helping Namibia, which was called Southwest Africa, free itself from South Africa. And so Cuba's policy was a policy of acquiring allies, third world allies. And in fact, to some extent it worked. Cuba became in 1979 the leader of the non-aligned movement. And then the Soviet Union betrayed them again by invading Afghanistan, which was a member of the non-aligned movement, and the invasion violated a fundamental principle of the movement, which was non-intervention. And so Cuba never felt good about its relationship with the Soviet Union, constantly tried to seek, but the United States, until 1989, saw Cuba as a puppet. Fast forward to 1989, Soviet Union begins to collapse. Eastern Bloc collapses, the Berlin Wall comes down. And at that point, President George H.W. Bush says, well, Cuba is no longer a foreign policy issue. It's now only a domestic policy issue. And he turns it over to Congress. What's the domestic policy? Florida, New Jersey. And Congress was very much in the pocket at that point of the Cuban-American National Foundation, which had been built up by the Reagan administration people on the board of the Cuban-American National Foundation were given large grants for their businesses, and in turn, they put money into congressional campaigns, and they were trained actually by the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, the large so-called Israeli lobby, how to manipulate elections. So the Congress now was in charge, and of Cuba policy. Congress was dominated by the Cuban-American National Foundation, right-wing Florida, New Jersey Congress people, and Congressman Torricelli from New Jersey introduced a bill in 1992 that was to tighten the embargo, stop the sale of goods to Cuba from U.S. corporations in third countries, make it difficult for Cuba to buy anything from international markets. And originally, President Bush was going to veto that. And then President Clinton, who was Governor Clinton, who was being hurt in the polls, got a large infusion of money all of a sudden from the Cuban-American National Foundation, and he came out in favor of the Torricelli bill, and then President Bush agreed to it also. And that became the new priority in U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba, getting the vote in Florida, getting the vote in New Jersey.
Do you feel that this was particularly about Cuba, or this was part of a trend that some scholars claim happened of a movement toward a rebalancing on the relationship between the executive and Congress in the immediate post-Cold War America?
No, I don't. So the rebalancing that occurred between the Congress and the president took place in the 1970s. There were several acts that Congress passed. For example, the War Powers Act, the Arms Control Act that prevented arms sales above a certain amount without congressional approval. Congress took back a lot of authority over foreign policy, but that essentially ended under Reagan.
Yeah, but some people claim that in the immediate post-Cold War, there was an epidemic of sanctions because Congress began to play a more assertive role in this area, where I understand the period that you mentioned in the 70s, but in this time, some people, concretely, Richard Haas, speak that in the context of the post-Cold War, the role of special interest groups increases because the centrality that the Cold War atmosphere create around the executive branch softened, and therefore he claimed that this might be one of the causes of what he called an epidemic or I think he called it an epidemic or a pandemic of sanctions, or a proliferation of sanctions that Congress began to adopt at that time. That was what I was referring to.
Yes, I mean, so there were. During the 1990s, Congress used sanctions as a way of trying to assert itself. But the fact is, those sanctions had very little impact. It was more symbolic than anything else. So Haas is wrong to focus on them as serious power. The only power that Congress actually exerted in this period was on trade. And trade is an interdomestic issue, has domestic and foreign components to it. And Congress did stop President Clinton from going any further after NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and he was unable to sign it. But then, as soon as President Bush came in, Congress gave him authority to negotiate, and we had a free trade agreement with Chile, with
Colombia,
Central America, with Colombia, Central America, and the Dominican Republic. So, Congress, and of course, gave the president the authority to use military force in Afghanistan and then Iraq. So no, Congress gave up an awful lot of power. After the Cold War, in the 90s, the president didn't really care that much. They could do sanctions. It wasn't going to affect what U.S. foreign policy was about. Because, I mean, after all, there was the expansion of NATO, a very major foreign policy effort. There was the opening to China in a significant way, despite Tiananmen and congressional protests. So Congress had very minimal power except on trade. And with respect to Cuba, Congress did have some influence. In 2000, well, in 1996, it passed the Helms-Burton Law, which significantly tried to undermine U.S. trade, foreign trade with Cuba as a way of hurting the Cuban economy. And it essentially codified all of the executive orders related to the embargo that previous presidents had put in place, meaning that the only way to change the embargo was with new law, not simply a presidential action. And the Helms-Burton Law, it looked like it was going to freeze policy in place. Congress then in 2000 relaxed the embargo some, allowed for some travel to Cuba, created 12 categories of general license for travel to Cuba, and allowed the sale of food and medicine. By 2008, Cuba was the 5th largest trading partner in agricultural goods for the United States. $700 million in goods were purchased from the United States. Nothing was sold to the United States, but $700 million was sold to Cuba from the United States. And so and that was largely a response to the farm lobby, which wanted to be able to sell goods to Cuba. The original bill in 2000 was sponsored by John Ashcroft, the very conservative senator who later became the Attorney General. So this was about domestic politics.
And in the House was also a Republican, George Nethercott, who was a congressman from Spokane, in the state of Washington. So exactly. It has Democratic support, but it was also a very popular bill among the Republicans.
And so Cuba was not seen ideologically, it was seen as a domestic issue. You'd satisfy Florida in some ways by not having too much openness. You'd satisfy the farm states by having agricultural produce sold to Cuba. And in Florida also, there was a demographic change. As a result of an agreement with Cuba in 1995, 20,000 Cubans were now coming to the United States every year. In fact, it was more in some years. A minimum of 20,000 were coming every year. And these Cubans who were coming had family in Cuba, recent family. They wanted to be able to visit, they wanted to be able to trade, send money to their families. And so Florida was not any longer a place where you could have a hard line and do well. And that was evident in 2008 when President Bush had put in place some very tough sanctions on the sending of remittances and the travel. Cuban Americans could travel to Cuba only once in 3 years to see their family, which people in Florida did not like. And President and Senator Obama in 2008 campaigned on the promise that he would change that. And for the first time, a Democrat nearly won Florida in the 2008 election.
I'm mentioning a topic that today is in the agenda. Also, Bush established a limit of $100 every 3 months in remittances. And by the way, it was not Bush the first one who put limits on remittances, because Clinton did it also in 1994 in the middle of the rafter crisis. But let's remember that Obama campaigned and won, as you said, saying about free travel for Cuban Americans and also no limit whatsoever on remittances.
And then he followed through with that promise, and in fact allowed unlimited travel.
By April 2009, he just before he traveled to Port Spain, he had honored his promise about this.
And in fact, he won a majority of Cuban Americans just barely in the 2012 election.
Yes.
And so domestic politics, again, was very important. President Obama thought he could then open up to Cuba and that would be supported. But the Republicans have, especially because of President Trump, turned it around again and made Cuba an anathema. Supporting Cuba became an anathema. And even though the Florida International University poll taken in 2020 indicated that Cuban Americans majority support sending money to their families wanting to travel, still a majority now reversed their position on the embargo itself and now favor the embargo. And so the Democrats think that what they have to do is being more hostile to Cuba than the Republicans in order to win votes. I think they're wrong. I think that that first of all, the Republicans who support that kind of policy, Cuban American Republicans, are not going to switch to a Democrat simply because of a moderate policy on President Biden's part. They don't trust the Democrats. They're not going to vote for Democrats. And second, there are Cuban Americans who want, in fact, to be able to send their money to their relatives and travel and visit aging grandparents, parents in some cases, aunts and uncles. And so the policy that President Biden is following is a policy of maintaining this harshness against Cuba in the theory that they can win some elections, some congressional seats in 2022, maybe even the Senate seat. Val Demings, Congresswoman, is running for the Democratic seat for the Senate on the Democratic ticket, and then they hope to win in 2024. I think they're mistaken, but that seems to be what's driving policy. What it seems from a Cuban perspective, though, is that the policy looks like it was in the Eisenhower administration, trying to squeeze Cuba so hard that the country will collapse. And in fact, this is an inhumane policy. It in no way reflects the so-called humane ambitions that President Biden claims he wants for US policy. In no way is it supporting the Cuban people. That is shameful to even say that when people are literally starving and literally need syringes to get COVID vaccinations, and the United States is denying that to them.
I agree with you in both accounts. It's a very bad foreign policy. And it's clear, or I think that your argument that it is a mistaken approach to policy or politics in Florida is also well argued. It is not, Biden is not going to attract any Cuban-American vote just because he is trying to out-Trump in these areas. Still, I think that the effect on Cuba, the cruel impact on Cuba, it will be significant. And we are seeing evidences of that. So I would like to return to the question on the priorities. I would like that if it is possible, you will see where do you think is Cuba in the list of priorities, and which issues in US-Cuba relations you will put as areas in which if they are highlighted, there might be a more conscious and serious discussion of the Cuban issue and the US-Cuba asymmetric relation in the White House.
So let's go back to 2012 for a minute. One of the things that shocked President Obama into changing Cuban policy was the Summit of the Americas. This is a summit that was begun, a practice of having summits under President Clinton in 1994, and every 3 years there's a summit of all the countries in the hemisphere except Cuba. In 2012, President Santos of Colombia announced at the end of the summit, which was being held in Colombia, that there would not be a summit in 2015 unless Cuba were allowed to participate. Whoa, President Obama, that came out of, he was blindsided. He had no idea that that was coming. And he comes back to Washington, he fires the national security advisor for Latin America because that guy should have known that this was coming. And he then after the election campaign, tells his deputy national security advisor to see what he can do about having better relations with Cuba. So one of the goals there was to improve relations with Latin America. There was a domestic component to it, but there was a foreign policy component, and the concern was Latin America. We were still at that point trying to fashion what our Latin American policy would be. Brazil was a great concern because Brazil was leading a group of countries against US hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And one of the things the United States was trying to do was siphon off some of the countries through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So countries on the Pacific coast of South America would be members of this Trans-Pacific Partnership, especially countries like Chile, which was an important part of Mercosur, the trading group that Brazil dominated. And so there were some options. Maybe we would divide and conquer. Maybe we would get back in the good graces of Latin America, particularly Brazil, which had the Labor Party that was running the government. They would perhaps be more friendly to the United States if we had better relations with Cuba. So Cuba rose up in priority, improving relationship. The Trump administration didn't care about it, didn't care about Latin America. He thought that everyone coming from Latin America were rapists and coming from bad countries. And so his attitude towards Latin America was dreadful. President Biden.
His first Secretary of State even talked about reviving the Monroe Doctrine.
Exactly.
That Secretary of State John Kerry has proclaimed the end of the Monroe Doctrine in the OAS. But
exactly.
but in the case of Trump and Tillerson, they talk about reviving the Monroe Doctrine and even discussing free trade, not as free trade, but as a renewal of the reciprocity treaty approach from the 19th century.
Exactly. And so neo-imperial policy, absolutely, which certainly didn't ingratiate the United States to some countries, but during the Trump administration, there was several countries turned to the right wing. So in Brazil, in Ecuador, Argentina, Bolivia, and they supported, despite this rhetoric, they supported the United States. President Biden comes into office then with an opportunity to reverse this. And I would say at this point, he doesn't have a policy towards Latin America. So when you ask what's the where in the priorities of US foreign policy does Cuba fit? It doesn't fit because Latin America doesn't fit. There is no policy towards Latin America. It was what one person described early in the administration as benign neglect. It's not causing us any trouble. We don't have to worry about it. And that was crazy because, in fact, there were demonstrations in Chile. There leftist wins in Peru. Now the President Lopez Obrador in Mexico has been very critical of the United States. All of a sudden, Latin America is turning against us. The focus has wholly been on the Northern Triangle in Central America, and even there, President Bukele of El Salvador has rebuffed the person sent down, Zuniga, who was the personal emissary from the president. In Guatemala, the they closed down the Office of Corruption that the U.S. was
Anti-corruption. The
Anti-corruption.
anti-corruption commission. No, the
It's
office
now
of
Office of Corruption, right? And so the Northern Triangle, which is supposedly the focus, the one focus of Latin American policy, is in disarray, even though it's headed by Vice President Harris. And so there is no policy towards Latin America. And in Colombia, if you take a look at the responses to the demonstrations. So in Cuba, as your listeners probably know, there were demonstrations in Cuba in mid-July, unprecedented demonstrations all over the country. Cuba has been denounced for repressing those demonstrations, putting 500 people in prison, approximately. In Colombia, there have been 50 people killed and hundreds of people injured in the protests against the government for basically the same reasons that people were protesting in Cuba: the rampant rise of COVID and the lack of food for people, and extraordinary inequality. Journalists have been killed in Colombia. None of that's happened in Cuba, but the United States denounces Cuba for this and actually supplies the arms to the Colombian military to commit those atrocities. So there is no policy towards Latin America. So it's very difficult to say that Cuba fits anywhere in the priority. It sits along with all the others.
So will you say that using your analogy, that the next summit of the Americas, can we anticipate that this will put the issue of Cuba in the interregional agenda between the US and Latin America? Or because it's even a summit that's supposed to take place in the United States. I don't know if there is a particular city, because some people were talking about even Miami, but
it's most likely at this point it'll be a Zoom conference, a virtual meeting, and it's supposed to take place in October.
But will the analogy hold? Will the analogy that
I think you've raised a very important possibility, and you should write about this, Arturo, because it's really an interesting issue. 2 weeks ago, Secretary of State Blinken asked countries all around the world to support a statement of support for the United States in its determination to attack Cuba for human rights violations. There were only 19 other countries that signed on to it. And of those 19, only 5 in Latin America. Interestingly, 4 of the 5 are repressive states that we hard pressed to call democratic: Guatemala, El Salvador, for example, Honduras.
Honduras, that has a worse record in this issue than anybody else. Probably.
And so the bulk of Latin America, no country in the Caribbean, the bulk of Latin America is not supportive of US policy. And it's very likely that Cuba will be on the agenda, and Cuba is, of course, now a regular participant in these summits. So it will be present also.
Okay, Phil, also as someone that has followed Cuba, I remember that I went to one of your classes when I was doing an internship in the Inter-American Dialogue. I asked you, and you were so generous that you allowed me to go and sit in your classes on U.S. Congress and foreign policy. Still, I keep the syllabus of that time because I have tried to read some of the readings that you assigned there. As someone that has, and I remember that in your classes, you referred a lot to news that happened the day before or even the same day. So you are someone that read a lot. In this sense, you are a scholar that not only read academic articles, but you try to keep as up date as possible. And I try to emulate that. And something that I see is that the media coverage, particularly in relation to the July 11 protests in Cuba, had followed a type of coverage, a type of pattern that, as you mentioned, is quite, frankly, I will not call it disinformation, but in some sense,
It's a distortion.
It's a distortion a lot of the reality that if I imagine that we were talking about another country, people will laugh or will say something that in America people will consider a typical hyperbolization. Let me give you an example. Members of Congress talking about a genocide taking place when only one person died in the protest. One is too many, it is clear. And I think that there are issues on human rights in Cuba that is logical that the United States, in its general approach, try to address. But this type of language even discredit the cause of an objective analysis or discussion about the topic in Cuba. So how do you see the media coverage in the United States? What role does this type of coverage play in this framework of analysis about U.S.-Cuba relationship? Because sorry if I am going too long on that, but I remember that it was quite symptomatic that before the December 17 agreement in 2014, there was a series of editorials in the New York Times, not the Washington Post. The Washington Post has followed more the idea of condemnation, even blaming the Cuban government for the death of Osvaldo Payá without any clear evidence about that. Even I think that a major journalist of the Washington Post is working, even I think in a biography, or I heard that he's working on a biography of Osvaldo Payá, on the premises that there was a government assassination of him, etc. But does the media reflect a will or a general consensus on the establishment that accept this distortion and misinformation, or let's say it, some kind of misinformation, or it has an autonomous role on this topic? Because you will expect more seriousness in the coverage of the Cuba issue, even by major US newspapers. Honestly, if you go to the Wall Street Journal, and believe me, Trump said that nobody read anymore the New York Times, but I still read the New York Times, and I do my best to read the Wall Street Journal. I am subscribed to the Wall Street Journal, but when you read a column like the one by Maria Anastasia O'Grady, and the way she talk about Cuba, you will think that she's talking about a country in another planet, not 90 miles south of Key West.
So I agree that the media and the major media has distorted what's happening in Cuba. It very much depends on the individual journalist, though. So, for example, in the New York Times, Anthony Faiola has written fairly
Washington Post. Anthony Faiola is in the Washington Post.
I'm sorry, in the Washington Post. He's written fairly, and
Karen
DeYoung has tried to, I think, write fairly objective analysis of both the Biden policy but even in the New York Times, the person who wrote those editorials in 2014, Ernesto Londoño, has been writing stories that don't reflect, I think, fully the reality of Cuba. Why? Well, for one thing, they're not in Cuba. If you look at the date lines, they're writing from either Miami or New York, and they're talking to a few people. When Faiola interviewed me, he asked me, give me some names of other people who are not the usual suspects that everyone interviews, because he wanted to get a full picture of what's going on. And the reality is that there's no bureau there except for the AP and Financial Times, Reuters, that is actually covering what's going on in Cuba. Al Jazeera has not been allowed back in. So Lucia Newman, who usually does good things, hasn't been allowed in. So the
Exactly.
Cubans have been keeping the press out, and it hasn't served their purpose because people don't really know what's happening. But I would say that uh, also the Cuban government has acted in some ways that have not helped their cause. The repression was unnecessary. They initially President Diaz-Canel said that the people who were protesting were all traitors. And then 2 days later, he said, well, yes, they have some legitimate grievances. Well, they do have some legitimate grievances. And he ought to acknowledge that in the first instance and say, come, let's talk about this. Let's figure out how to do this together. What's interesting about the protesters, and they're still widespread protests online through the internet. What's interesting about the protesters is that they don't really have a plan for how to make changes in Cuba. They talk about more free enterprise. Well, free enterprise is not going to provide Cuba with the ability to export things, while the United States has Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. No, international banks don't want to touch Cuba, so the costs are extraordinary. I mean, so the protesters aren't being realistic about what it would mean for Cuba, in fact, to change direction. It can't. There's a context in which all of this is happening, and they don't have a plan yet to figure out how to make Cuba thrive. And that's but the government doesn't either. And so, and the distrust of the government when it just puts out lies that people can see with their own eyes are not true doesn't help the situation. When they repress dissent, they cut off the internet. Those are not useful things. And Cuba is not a state that's just going to beat people up. The police won't do that. The police are not going to just repress people without any real justification, unless someone's breaking into a store. And there was some of that looting. So I'd say that the reality right now in Cuba is that there is a lot of distrust, chaos, but a lot of suffering. And that what the United States has to understand is this suffering is not going to overthrow the government. This suffering is a human rights catastrophe, and the United States is contributing in a major way to it.
I agree with you on this, but let me point out that even in the I agree with you that particularly those who have been covering the island from inside, and you mentioned AP, you mentioned Lucia Newman, the role I have seen the reporting by Anthony Faiola that it's clear pursue some objectivity in its coverage, but I was referring more to the editorial lines in the major newspapers.
No, because the Washington Post has Jackson Deal, who for a long time has distorted what any situation with the progressive forces in Latin America. And even the New York Times has put op-eds in there from Cuban-Americans that don't really have a...
Frankly, there are issues that some fact-checking it could correct.
Exactly.
And let me give you, for instance, an example. In the obviously the statement of Mr. Diaz-Canel, or President Diaz-Canel, was quite tough on this first statement. At the same time, even earlier, the first day he mentioned the idea that there were people there that he called it confused, and even he said that there were revolutionaries there with legitimate grievances. Obviously, the most important thing was his call to arms, not to arms, but he called to combat, was the way he used, or to struggle.
That was the problem.
It's the area where I understand the responses. But something that I feel is that despite the expansion of information available about Cuba in the United States, and about United States in Cuba too, by the way, at times I'm not sure that this has produced a more well thought evidence guide analysis in the political realm.
No.
And this is something that is touching me, particularly in the area of social networks, internet, the more availability of information. Information have a good place on producing good policy if it is framed in the proper analysis. And there are analogies, for instance, to North Korea, analogies even by important actors to Nazi Germany that are simply the wrong approach to Cuba. And it is happening, I would say, with more frequency now, despite of this virality of information that circulate in internet, etc., than I would say after 2009, 2010, during the Obama years. There was more calm, well thought discussion in many of the newspapers. There was more fact checking. It seems at times that some
Well, part of it is coming from the head. I mean,
Yep.
President Biden's statements have been dreadful.
For instance, he called Cuba a failed state. And
disingenuous.
it's-
But let me just pick up as a last point something you just said. One of the policies the United States has is to produce disinformation in Cuba. We spend $20 million a year on programs to create these kinds of chaotic messages, bots going in. There was photos circulating, for example, of mass demonstrations on the Malecon, but it turned out that those were photos from Egypt.
Exactly.
So the United States.
I will say, Phil, areas such as the success or alleged failure of Obama policy, it's something that is people are peddling this discourse that Obama didn't receive any answer, or that the Cuban government missed the train of an opportunity there, when in reality, this policy was predicated on serving the interests and values of the United States.
Exactly.
And if you look at these 2 years, there was a quite successful policy in these terms. For instance, what you mentioned about the image of the United States in Latin America, it was quite successful on the idea of telling the Cuban government, we are not anymore the great obstacle to the prosperity of a private sector in Cuba. It's true that the Cuban government tried to put some order in the private sector during those years, and in this, probably they overshoot the actions that they took in this area. But to claim that the Obama policy was produced as a result, a reduction in the in Cuba's private sector is simply a lie, because
it's a
during
big lie.
those years there was an expansion of the private sector and the profitability of the private sector. I know a particular case that in the New Year Eve of 2016, I was visiting Trinidad, a beautiful town in the south of Cuba that I know you know. And you know, the municipality allow people to rent rooms without a license, because there were so many tourists there that it was not enough for those who were registered as private sector bed and breakfast. I'm not talking about Airbnb. There are people that are in Airbnb, but there are people that are registered as a legal bed and breakfast. And the municipality of Trinidad, because they have a few hotels there, say anybody who had a room and wanted to rent during those days, you should do it, because there were people sleeping in cars or sleeping about foreigners sleeping in cars or sleeping
parks.
Yeah, in the parkings or things like that. And I think that this has been part of the coverage on the idea of justifying a closing of the possibility of a policy of rapprochement again. I think that the media, in this sense, has not done such a good job, and even being critical of statements by American politicians. Senator Rubio made a speech in the floor claiming that the embargo doesn't exist. And what is the purpose of defending a policy that doesn't exist? He claimed that there was a blockade and embargo by the Cuban government, but no role of sanctions on creating troubles in Cuba for the policy of the United States. And I will expect that some people in the media will publish something like that. It is very difficult to find opportunities. I sent op-ed to some of these newspapers. Perhaps the quality was not
no, they don't want to, right?
But they don't publish anything about that. I want to ask you also about what do you think is the role of economic relations between Cuba and the United States? How much the expectation of business is as important as in comparison with other cases? Cuba is not in a dynamic economic zone like East Asia. Cuba is 0.12 of the global product, while the United States is more than 20%. Some people even claim that by now China is a larger economy than the United States, but the United States is either the number one or very close to the number as the number two of the largest economy in the world. How do you think how important do you think is this idea of economic relation and the role of business groups in the promotion of cooperation between Cuba and the United States?
I think business groups have no longer felt that they can profit so much from Cuba. And I think there's been a decline in interest. Of course, the hotel industry, the tourist industry, cruise lines, and some farm industry, pharmaceutical companies would like to work with Cuba, but this is a small amount of money. It's not, they have many bigger fish to fry. One possibility at one time was that Cuba has a large number of oil deposits, but they're located so deep that the cost of extracting oil from them won't be profitable until oil goes to $125 a barrel. And that's not likely to happen in the near future. So I think business people are no longer in the forefront. What has to happen is that people have to recognize there are benefits to the United States even beyond business. For example, Cuba has a set of vaccines that could help the United States, Americans. 60,000 Americans every year lose their limbs to amputation because of diabetes. Cuba has a proven effective medication that prevents those amputations. Imagine 60,000 Americans losing limbs every year. Right now in Roswell Park, New York, under FDA supervision, Cuba is going through trials on a lung cancer vaccine that they say has had positive results in Cuba. Lung cancer. A lot of people get lung cancer in the United States. It's just a small example. Cuba was the #1 country in support of anti-drug trafficking with the DEA in the Western Hemisphere. Very important cooperation. That's been reduced because of the Trump and Biden administrations. It's in the interest of the United States to stop drug trafficking. I mean, so it's apart from businesses, there are some fundamental interests we have. And Americans should be free to travel. It's a human right. Anyone should be able to travel to Cuba, and it's wrong that we don't let people travel.
So we are living in the period or in the time of COVID-19. A question important is how does this pandemic is affecting? How is this pandemic affecting the relationship between Cuba and the United States. And here I want to mention a couple of elements that might, let's say, put on the table. I want to put them on the table because I have been quite surprised on the way the US government has managed this situation. In 2016, President Biden wrote an article for Foreign Affairs, of this type of articles that you notice that people who are thinking to run for president write in Foreign Affairs, in which they say about what is their ideas US foreign policy should be, and it is a kind of anticipation of their term. I go to 2016 because he doesn't mention it in 2020, but there are lines between the articles that he wrote in 2020 and the line in 2016. And he talked about American leadership, and he talked about transnational threats. And here he mentioned the role of pandemics as one problem that, one transnational threat that we are going to see more frequently, in which the United States leadership might be very important. He used a case in which he said that the Obama-Biden administration, he talked about the Obama-Biden, not only the Obama, but the Obama-Biden administration showed great leadership. And it was the response to the pandemic of Ebola in Western Africa. If we look at this particular case, it's a case in which the cooperation between Cuba and the United States was quite significant, to the point that Ambassador Samantha Power, currently the chief of the USAID, she in her speech that is available, and the audience can check it at the Belfer Center in Harvard. You go to the website, you put Samantha Power speeches in the UN, and you look for the speech on the embargo, on the US embargo on Cuba, the vote in the United Nations. She also claimed, very proud about the cooperation between Cuba and the United States, and even the fact that a Cuban doctor that got sick in the struggle against Ebola was hospitalized in a US military ship, and then later he was flown to Switzerland, to Cuba, and eventually he came back to fight against the pandemic. So I was expecting, honestly, that this was an area of constructivist theory, talk a lot about common enemies, communities of common faith, as way to transform enemies into neutrals, or from neutrals to friends. And it was something that from constructivist IR theory, you will say there is a tremendous challenge, and there is also a tremendous opportunity. Particularly because of the geographical proximity, that regardless of the priority in other areas, such as the old security agenda, in the new security agenda, pandemics is one of the area. But it didn't happen. 6 months after, not only that there was not the road of pursuing a common response of cooperating was not followed, but even more than that, in the middle of the pandemic, when every dollar counts for food or for medicines to save a life, the administration didn't move on the remittance issue. And after 6 months, it has a meeting with members of the Cuban-American community. And rather than say, well, we will restore remittances, and then we are going to discuss later how we try to reduce the amount of money that the Cuban government get. What they did is, no, they assumed the Trump position of no remittance as default, and they say that they will create a group for another month, a group of remittance for another month, operating on the continuation of the cruel policy on this issue that Trump already adopted. So where is the leadership in this area?
Well,
what can we say on this?
you raise a very important point. I would say it's not that it's wrong to think about Cuba as unique in this case. The United States has not been a leader internationally on the pandemic. Uh, Along with other wealthy countries, it essentially hoarded the vaccine um, for uh, for Americans and has not distributed very much. I mean, it's given 50,000, 100,000 doses where millions of doses are needed. Africa is unvaccinated. This is in the interest of the United States to contain this virus. It should be working everywhere. Uh, and of course, in the case of Cuba, uh, Cuba is very close to the United States, and the pandemic essentially is what's destroyed the Cuban economy because they closed the island as a way of preventing COVID, so there were no tourists. And it made it very difficult for Cuba to buy anything, especially food, without any hard currency coming in. But I think this is a bigger failure than just Cuba. It's an international failure for the United States, for the Biden administration, and certainly the Trump administration.
Well, thank you for your answer on this issue. That it was quite short. Also, Phil, I wanted to ask you one final question. Now, when you see the discussion about grand strategy or big policy formulations, it is clear that the importance of China is gaining traction. There is also a discussion of US role in the world as a bulwark of democracy versus rising authoritarianism, in which the pivot to Asia has a role, but also with important mention to Russia and other actors with, by the way, some connotations that are domestic. I don't know if you see that there was this Fox interview by Tucker Carlson to Viktor Orban, and there is a lot of, there is a narrative that is building on the issue of authoritarianism versus democracy. Do you anticipate that this will have an impact on the policy towards Cuba? You will expect that there might be different ways to look at this. At the end of the Johnson administration, when you were the PhD candidate, I remember that there. Well, I was not born, but Pete Byron Becky shared with me a document that later there is some reference in the Bill Leo Grant that has been your co-author, another of the greatest scholars that is studying Cuba, and Peter Kombruk, that is also a very prestigious scholar that has studied this issue of, particularly in the book Back Channel to Cuba. And in this document, by the end of the Johnson administration, it is a kind of document that was prepared for a potential Hoover Humphrey presidency that never happened. They mentioned the idea of peeling off Cuba from the alliance with the Soviet Union on the idea that even the interest of contention of communism will be better served, but finding a kind of Tito in the Caribbean, in which the attraction of the possibility of trade relations with the United States will compete for the hearts and minds of the Cubans, but also will represent a different approach that will show an America in a better position to compete at the world level. That's one interpretation. The other will be to say Cuba is part of the authoritarian camp, and therefore we should have a general policy toward the authoritarian camp. The point of this second choice is that it has been a failure, as you mentioned earlier on the interview, when you mentioned of looking at Vietnamese as kind of Soviets in Indochina, or looking at the Cubans as Soviets in the Caribbean. And I want to ask you about that. I would like to see your, I know that we are trying to anticipate something, and Yogi Berra said that it's very difficult to make forecasts, especially about the future. But I would like to hear your guest, or your educated guest, about this issue. What do you think the U.S. policy is going? What do you think should be part of this debate? What do you think are the components of this debate? Because on the other hand, if you follow Linz and Stepan on this issue, you need to have a good diagnostic of the situation in Cuba. It's a post-charismatic Cuba. It has a tremendous segment of private sector. So there is economic pluralism there. There is ideological pluralism because there is a strong patriotism, nationalism competing in the minds of many Cubans with the traditional communist, Leninist,
and a growing religious
view.
evangelical.
There is a big societal pluralism in terms of religions. There is a lot in which political science, and particularly good, serious studies on democratization and human rights, that might be, or human rights foreign policy. For instance, Jack Donnelly and David Forsyth had studied this issue in quite a good way. Deborah Lee and Fenton, and other even scholars in your own university that has done very serious studies on the best practices on human rights foreign policy, or the difference between liberalization and democratization, that in my view can make more complex, but at the same time more realistic and based on evidence and good argument, this discussion. But I'm afraid that we are going in the wrong direction. A lot of people are quoting the so-called failure of the policy toward China because China has not democratized in their views, and they are using that to claim that in the Cuban discussion, a policy of detente will not be, or rapprochement or interaction will not be the proper policy. And in my view, honestly, they are so wrong that I would like to hear your views on this issue. Sorry if I make too long the question.
I'll just be very brief. Those people who want to claim that the Cold War now is being reproduced with China, some people are calling a cold peace, are mistaken because they're overlooking a very major factor. When the United States and the Soviet Union were at loggerheads in the Cold War, there was very little trade between the two countries.
Exactly.
And there is enormous trade with China. In fact, even despite the tariffs that President Trump imposed on China, US trade with China increased last year. And the United States, China holds $1 trillion in US debt. This is an enormous leverage over the United States. And no one else is buying US debt the way China has bought US debt. And so, yes, there's going to be significant competition. There's an arms industry in the United States that needs to have an enemy. And so they will try to create this. They will try to divide the world into them and us. And if they're successful, well, Cuba will be part of that because Cuba is actively working with China. China has come to Cuba's assistance. But I don't think they're going to be successful because the reality is so different than it was during the Cold War. I mean, someone like Trump might create a big lie, a next Trump. But if people are willing to listen to the reality, they may not like China. They may be, there's going to be a debate about whether the United States should participate in the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. And that would be a serious setback to a peaceful world. But I think that the idea that there's going to be this new Cold War and everything will be divided into is not realistic, partly because China is not in a position to do that. That's not their ambition. China.
What about potential spillover for the discussion on the Cuba issue?
I think it's very small. China's footprint China doesn't have a military footprint in Cuba. It has an economic footprint. And in fact, it's not even very much in Cuba's benefit. They extract enormous concessions from Cuba. And so I think that if you can get accurate information out, it'll debunk the idea that Cuba is a puppet of China.
I was not referring to the idea of a puppet, but that they will do a kind of ideological mimetism.
Yeah.
That they will try to.
I mean, of course, that's possible. The world is filled with, but I think that
Mauricio Claver Caroni, in particular, he was transmitting a program that he called it From Washington to the World. It was in Sirius, a radio program that he will transmit in Sirius Radio.
And he's the director of the Inter-American Development Bank.
Now he's the director.
President.
He's not doing it. The president. He's not doing it anymore.
But that's his ideology. Yes.
But he was pushing that, and there was a congressman. I think it was from Michigan, or it was a congressman from the Midwest, who was calling during the Obama administration that he should define China as an enemy, and basically they did a program in which they were using this.
Yes, there are going to be those attempts. My own prediction, along with Yogi Berra, is that it's not going to be successful because it lacks veracity in terms of what's going on.
Okay. Well, at the end of the program, who do you, if you have to make a list of people that played a major role in the relationship between the two countries, who do you think, which personality shouldn't be ignored?
Senator Patrick Leahy, Congressman Jim McGovern, Ben Rhodes, the Deputy National Security.
So you're talking about today?
Today, in the past?
I was saying in general, but it's today. I agree with you that they are great.
In the past, I would say Adolph Burley, who people don't know, but had been in the
undersecretary for hemispheric, Latin American,
but long time ago. But he was in the kitchen cabinet for President Franklin Roosevelt, but an informal advisor, very anti-communist for President Kennedy and President Johnson. So he was very influential in shaping, particularly Johnson's views about Latin America.
And the last one, as a great scholar of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which factor do you think it has been underappreciated in the general study of this crisis? If there is one factor that you want to say,
there is Cuba's role. Cuba's role has been ignored. People forget that the crisis continued actually after the famous 13 days because Cuba was insisting on its sovereignty. And the United States was still at the highest state of alert before nuclear war, DEFCON 2, and we could have had a nuclear war during those days. It lasted a month longer because of Cuba.
There is a great book that I think that I'm sure that you read it, The November Crisis, by that is with the I don't remember now the name of the Russian woman that wrote it together with the son of Sergei Mikoyan. Yeah.
Yes, Svetlana Savranskaya.
Svetlana Savranskaya. So Phil, thank you very much for this conversation. It has been a great pleasure that you.
My pleasure, my honor to work with you, Arturo.
You took the time to answer my questions. And as a Cuban-American, I simply want to say, when I see people like you that has taken so seriously the study of my country of birth, it makes me proud of my country of adoption, the United States.
Thank you.
I thank you for your work as a scholar and also the work as a bridge between the two countries. It has been, without any doubt, a bridge of love, the one that you have tried to build. So you are always welcome in Conversaciones Americanas. I'm sorry if my English at times was not as good as
Excellent.
it should
Excellent.
be.
I'm sorry that I only could do this in English.
But I want to thank you immensely for the time that you dedicate to me and my audience today.
Thank you for doing this project. I think it's very important.